Hello, and welcome back to Fire in the Cosmos. This is Anthony here. This is a unique episode in that I will be conducting this solo, and it will just be in audio format, and it will contain a recording that I made back in 2023 in 3 parts over a span of a few months after my first major anomalous experience. Now, I shared this experience in parts a bit broken up and kind of all over the place in the very first episode that I conducted with my former co-host when we were known as Obliterate the Construct. But we have since removed that episode in keeping with my former co-host's wishes, as she has now moved on to a different path and out of these fields. This recording describes in detail a bit about my own history, my upbringing, and how I got to where I was a few years ago, back in 2023, and the protocol I created, how I created it, the journey I went on, the rabbit holes I explored, and I hope that it can be helpful to many people out there and hopefully assist them in their own journeys and their efforts to try to navigate these complicated fields. I do apologize for some background noise in some of the recordings, as this was recorded for my personal use and to share with a few trusted confidants when I first experienced this to get their advice. So thank you and enjoy. And as always, please remember to hit those subscribe and like buttons on YouTube. We're still a pretty new show and would love your help working that algorithm to help us get in front of a wider audience. And please turn on alerts or notifications to keep up with our current releases. If you're listening on other platforms, your ratings go a long way to helping us expand our reach there as well. We also love receiving your comments and questions on these platforms or on our socials, so please send those our way. And if you'd like to support us financially, please join the community that we're developing on Patreon and sign up over there, where we have a $5 per month supporter tier as well as a free option. Use the link in the description or follow us on our socials. Thanks for listening and enjoy. First off, thank you for taking the time to listen to my story and hear me out. I'd just like to give some context first before I dive into things, and I want to be clear that I'm not reading off of any notes or anything, so if I'm going back and forth in my story and it seems a little bit unstructured, that's why. I've told this a few times to some close friends and family members after my experience, and I'm basically going off of the memory of that and the memory of the experience itself. And before I begin, I just want to be clear that I'm requesting my anonymity because of, not necessarily because of the stigma around the UAP or UFO or phenomenon topic, but more so because of my career. I am an open source intelligence analyst for a private contractor with the government. I do not currently hold any clearances, but in my field, clearances are very important for seeking out jobs. And my story does involve the use of a substance that is currently illegal in most states as well as federally, but hopefully will no longer be illegal. All right, so again, some more context of my background. Like I said, I've been an open source intel analyst for 15 years, and that experience has taught me to try to ingest information from as many sources as I can on any topic that I'm looking into, and looking for patterns across that information, connecting dots, sifting out noise, and trying to take a step back and get a clear picture of everything from multiple angles in order to draw a conclusion. and I never really applied that rigor in my personal study and research of the UAP phenomenon. But my interest in the phenomenon was always there, probably for the past 10 to 15 years. And I probably only recently began applying that sort of rigorous analytical framework to this. I would say from 2019, 2020 or so to today. And the 2017 New York Times story and the coming out of Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon, that played a big role in it. And I guess also during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, just having a bit more contemplative time on my hands allowed me to go back and really look into that story and got me more interested in researching this on a personal level. All right, so some more background. I was raised in a very conservative Catholic immigrant family, first-generation immigrants from the Middle East. And, I grew up in the church. I was an altar boy, very religious, but with that religiosity and conservativeness, it also filtered out into my social life and a bunch of other aspects of my life. Probably until the time I went to college, really allowed me to open up a bit more, get out of my family circle, my immediate circle of relatives, and move away from home for the first time, meet new people, be surrounded by new and unexplored ideas, and explore interesting courses. And all of that was kind of around the time of the 2008 presidential election in the U.S. And I saw how much politics was kind of becoming interspersed with religion every time I would go to church, probably around my freshman year of college. That was probably around my junior year of college, before that election. And that, coupled with, all the new ideas I'd been exposed to and the new friends that I was surrounding myself with, gave me a different perspective on religion. And I took a pretty large step back from it. At that point, I kind of always held this spiritual but not religious label ever since then. I guess I would say I believed in a higher power, but not in the structures and dogma of religion that I'd always believed that had been misconstrued by humanity in different forms across different societies and religions. And that's kind of been my belief system since college. So I think that's a good amount of context. So since the pandemic started, again, I've been researching the UAP topic, applying similar rigor as I do professionally in my job to this issue. And I learned not to discount as many things as I would have in the past that I would have previously considered too out there or too quote-unquote woo. And I gradually began looking more into the consciousness angle of things, especially once I saw that consciousness issues, things like remote viewing, had been actually studied and utilized by the U.S. government and intelligence community for several decades. And that kind of gave it some more legitimacy, I guess, in my eyes. So I looked into it a bit deeper, and around the same time, I began exploring, probably going down similar rabbit holes that most people do once they really dive into this phenomenon. But, that led me to Skinwalker Ranch, started reading those books, and saw even more connections and concurrence between what we would have considered as paranormal activity, even what people have considered spiritual activity, and UAP phenomenon. So all of that, as well as the consciousness angle, looking into things like the Monroe Institute, expanding my library of podcasts and books to cover as many of these topics as I could, and increasingly seeing connections where I hadn't before, and experiencing what I guess people would consider synchronicities as I kind of wove my way down this rabbit hole and would come across seemingly unrelated issues or topics that later I would find a connection in. So that eventually led me into looking at substances like DMT and ayahuasca once I began hearing about people's anecdotal experiences on those substances, specifically claims of meeting quote-unquote non-human entities in various shapes and forms, and those entities relating information to the people that tended to be insightful about their lives, usually beneficial, sometimes having seemingly precognitive type aspects to them. And around the same time, after doing a bit more research into the Monroe Institute and hearing more credible accounts of things like heist and CE5 techniques, and seeing connections between meditation, remote viewing modalities through the Monroe Institute, as well as heist and CE5. And that seemed to kind of connect the spirituality and psi and UAP topics all together for me. And so this was all happening around the same time that I began hearing more and more about DMT, and I had decided to kind of try, I guess, taking a more hands-on approach to my research, and I viewed an initially safer route as being starting with exploring the Monroe Institute. And I was able to, considering how expensive their courses turned out to be, I managed to get a hold of trove of all the guided meditations in the gateway process, as well as some instructional material, PDFs, that I viewed as being enough for me to get started on learning that process. Initially just looking into it on my own, and then actually finding one of my friends who was more, slightly interested in the UAP topic and nowhere near as in-depth as I had become. But I gave him a bit of background, and he was interested in joining me as we tried to work our way and progress through the gateway process or gateway experience material with the Monroe Institute. And we decided to do this on our own. We would try each meditation like 2 or 3 times, splitting it up, doing it in our own apartments, and then meeting once a week or once every other week in person, and doing this at night under the night sky and sky watching, and trying, I guess, to see if we could elicit some sort of greater experience by having the both of us there, both of our energies, and maybe trying some sort of heist or CE5 techniques after the gateway meditations. And these were very rudimentary. We don't have too much heist or CE5 experience, so we don't have all the access to that material that we probably would like to have. So our primary focus, I would say, was more so on the gateway experience. So I would say about 2 months into those gateway sessions that I was doing with my friend, we were working our way through wave 1, which is the first course, I guess, in that process. And we were almost fully through that. I decided to look more into DMT, and from what I had read and heard and came across in my research, considering how advanced or strong DMT was in terms of an experience, a psychedelic experience, and considering I had never done any sort of psychedelics before, the only thing I had done was weed. And that was, not even regularly, just very sparse. So I did not have any sort of experience with psychedelics or anything near the strength of DMT. So I'd heard that it was better to begin with something like psilocybin. So I hadn't done much research on that, but the research I had done basically gave me the idea that this would be like a a much lower level experience than with DMT. I did not expect to meet any non-human entities on my journey with psilocybin. I just expected to come out of it with like a deeper understanding of myself, less ego, and a better view of the interconnectedness of things, of life, of nature and humanity. And, I didn't have any sort of underlying psychological issues, so I didn't view it as a therapeutic substance in that sense. But I just figured it would be an overall good experience. So that's really all I expected going into it. Anyway, I managed to come across some mushrooms, seemingly from a legal source. And I found a different close friend of mine who I'd known for a long time and trusted, who had experience with psilocybin, and I decided to see if he was interested in guiding me through the process, I guess. And we set a date and decided to go through with it. So stepping back a bit, with the gateway process meditations, I hadn't had up to that point, I hadn't had any real mind-blowing or what I would expect to be considered remote viewing type experiences at the point that I had reached thus far in my meditative work with those exercises. The only thing I would say I'd experienced up to that point was some interesting, like, almost out-of-body type feelings during some of the meditations. I would get like flashes of imagery that I believed were based off of preconceptions I had in my mind. Not that I wanted to have these images. Each gateway process meditation begins with like a process of clearing your mind and putting away your thoughts and worries and things like that. So I would always do that, and I think I would do it pretty successfully. But I would have like flashes of every once in a while. I would get like your standard gray alien face flashing here and there. Sometimes generally it would just be like almost like a lava lamp type shapes in my mind's eye. And generally it would be like red and blue colors, like red and blue lava swirling around, and not really much more than that in terms of what I would see. Now, there was one time where I got like a few words that seemed to just come to my mind in the middle of one of these meditations when I was in, I think, what they call the 10th state, which is in a pretty deep meditative state. And I had some random words come to my mind that I hadn't really drawn anything from. And they weren't overtly, they weren't UAP related in any way or form. Anyway, so that's some context on where I was up to that point in Gateway. So as I prepped for the psilocybin experience, I had done some research on that. Like I said, I listened to a lot of stuff from Andrew Huberman, the neuroscientist at Stanford University, and I wanted to follow methodically as much of the type of process that he explained would be most beneficial for people from a neuroplasticity standpoint, based on the latest science coming out of clinical trials and pretty good evidence. So as part of that, the idea was to undertake the whole journey on these mushrooms with my eyes to kind of cover that the prefrontal cortex from kind of being overdosed with what your eyes are seeing around you, and focus more inward. So I knew I wanted to go into it doing that. I'd also heard that listening to certain types of music would aid in that neuroplasticity, and these ranged from different classical types of music to jazz to even like shamanic type drums. And I chose to go with the shamanic drums. So when I began this experience with mushrooms, I basically took the shrooms and I wanted to try to implement the various techniques that I had been doing from a meditative standpoint to expand my consciousness and try to couple them with this experience in hopes, I guess I expected there to be some sort of connection and almost like an amplification of the expansion of consciousness that I was looking for. And I kind of made that my intent going into this experience, that I just wanted to have a deeper consciousness experience, and I wanted it to be a positive experience. So, yeah, I began by first doing a breathing exercise that I think is like a combination of Wim Hof deep breathing techniques as well as pranayama techniques. And it was just some video that I found on YouTube, and the claim behind this was that this exercise would naturally release DMT in your pineal gland. And again, like I said, I had seen some connections or alleged connections between DMT, the pineal gland, and consciousness and spirituality. So I tried this breathing exercise first that I had done several times actually before. And then I did one of the early gateway process meditations to just try to open up my mind even more. And I would say and this was right after I took the shrooms, so within the first 40 minutes or so. And in the middle of the gateway process meditation, that's when I began to first feel the effects of the psilocybin hitting. And it kind of, I guess anyone who's done this knows it begins with like a giggling phase. And the way that manifested in my gateway meditation, well, again, while my eyes were covered, I just started seeing in the blackness that was kind of pervasive in my mind's eye. I just started seeing, I guess, like eyes popping out in the darkness, and it seemed like the eyes were laughing, and I found it humorous, and it kind of threw me out of the deeper state that I had attained at that point. And that's the first time that had happened to me during these meditations, because again, normally I do a pretty good job of closing off my mind to any distractions, and this time the distractions were coming through, and I just found them humorous, and I figured that was just the psilocybin starting to hit. So I managed to push through it, and I finished the meditation. And I would say as I finished it, I realized this like feeling of heaviness, extreme heaviness in my body, almost as if there were like a giant anvil pressing down on me as I was lying down on this. And I had experienced something similar to that in one of the previous gateway meditations I had done that was intended to be done before sleep and almost induce an out-of-body type experience, or train you how to bring that on and bring yourself back into your body. And I had a similar feeling with that, where my body just felt extremely heavy as I was laying in bed. And that's the only time that had happened before. And when I came out of the meditation that I was doing now under psilocybin, I looked at my other friend who was doing it, and I asked him if he was feeling that type of heaviness or if that was normal, and he kind of brushed it off. And at that point, again, we were both in that giggle phase, so we were just kind of laughing at anything. So we were just laughing for like 10 minutes about stupid shit, and he basically told me that, you know, a little heaviness he guessed was normal, but not like what I was experiencing. And I tried not to like dwell on it. Again, I was on a mission, so I got over the laughing phase pretty quickly, and I knew that my next step in the process that I wanted to do was to go back to like covering my eyes and putting on this like shamanic music and diving in. So that's exactly what I did. Just covered my eyes with a blanket and found like just a repetitive track on YouTube. It was like a 7-hour soft shamanic drum track, and it was just repetitive. And my friend was doing his own thing. Like, he was not doing what I was doing. I tried to explain it to him, but he just kept his eyes open, and he just, you know, he had his own plan in mind, and he'd done it before. So anyway, I put on the music, put on my earplugs, covered my eyes, and I was almost instantly, and this was about 1 hour into the experience, so around the time that psilocybin chose to really be starting to hit. So I covered my eyes, and I began by seeing like the same blackness that I would see around me in my typical Monroe Institute meditations. But soon thereafter, it felt like my consciousness was shot out into a different blackness. One that felt more like it was displaced from my own mind and was an actual place. Not necessarily like in space-time, but just it felt like I was somewhere else. And I was almost instantly, I felt like I was in the presence of beings. It was more than feeling like I was in the presence of them. It was like I knew with certainty that I was in the presence of some other beings. And going forward, I'm going to say that they told me or they talked to me, but when I say that, I don't mean verbally. Information basically came to me, and I knew that it came from them. So I don't know if you'd call this downloads or channeling or what, but I had never experienced anything like this, and that's the best way I can describe it, is the information just came to me, and I knew that it was coming from them. So they told me that they were the quote-unquote old gods. And when they said this, it was as if they were saying it not to tell me that they were deities in a religious sense, but that they were what humanity has always considered the old gods. Almost as if telling me that humanity had this idea of them, and it wasn't the right idea, but they were just trying to allow me to understand who they were, and that was the only way they could. So apologies for any loud breathing, because I get a little bit of anxiety when I discuss this, which is interesting because this only happens to me when I'm like public speaking or talking about issues that are deeply personal to me. I get this type of anxiety, and I noticed that I've been getting this every time I try to speak about this experience. So anyways, again, they told me they were the old gods, and I got a few flashes of imagery when they said this, and one image was like, I guess, a humanoid type being with almost like an eagle or a falcon head, and it reminded me of like ancient Egypt or like an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph. And I don't have any real experience with that. I've never really researched that. I had watched, I was into Ancient Aliens, I would say 7 or 8 or 9 years prior to this experience, and I hadn't really watched it since. So I don't know where this came from and how legitimate it was, but that's the image that flashed before me. So as my mind or my consciousness was trying to come to grips with what I was experiencing, I got flashes of, I did get flashes of ancient Egypt after getting this image of this being. I also got flashes of Norse mythology and Norse deities, again, which I hadn't studied deeply. I was exposed to Norse mythology only in an academic sense in 6th grade. So several decades prior to this experience. And beyond that, my only other experiences were in things like Marvel movies. And at shows like Vikings and things like that. But that's it. Hadn't really studied it. So I get flashes of Norse mythology and ancient Egyptian mythology, and it's like the beings were telling me that these cultures or these societies were kind of close in their depictions of them. And that, not to say that they were correct, but that they were close. And The beings told me that humanity had gotten it wrong, and they were laughing at us. They began laughing at us, and I felt like they were laughing at humanity as a whole. That moment really shook me, enough so that I took off the cover over my eyes. I took off my earbuds, and I looked at my friend, who was, again, just hanging out on a recliner with his eyes open in his own world. And I had to tell him, like, I just felt like I had to tell him. And all I said was, they're laughing at us. They're laughing at us. And I tried to quickly, like, run him through what I just explained, and he was out of it. So I just put the cover back over my eyes and put in my earbuds with that track playing, and I was transported right back to where I was in front of these beings. I felt like there was like a handful of them. The only one whose image that flashed in front of me was this being with like a falcon or eagle head. The others I didn't really get images of, but it's hard to explain, but it was like they were extremely tribal and connected to nature. Almost like you would think of like Native American or Celtic type spirits or deities. Not that I got those cultures or societies like flashing in my mind, but thinking about it now, that's the best way I can describe my sense of the beings as a whole. And I got a sense that, again, there were a handful of them, and it felt like it was like probably somewhere between 7 to 10, no more than that, and probably not less than like 6. I couldn't see them individually or feel them individually. I just felt them as a whole, almost like a panel or a council that I was before. And the environment that we were in, again, like physically, it was blackness, but the feelings that I was experiencing felt like it was some sort of other reality, other dimension. I don't know how to describe it, but something that was enveloping our reality and our dimension here. It's hard for me to put words to it, but it felt like it was enveloping us, and that it was the true reality, and that this was just something else that we were experiencing here on Earth. So after getting flashes of Norse and ancient Egyptian culture and mythologies, it was like I had questions for them, and I would just receive answers or receive information. And it wasn't like strictly like asking and answering. It was just like, again, time is kind of warped, and this wasn't verbal. Senses are warped. So I'll just say it was asking and answering. But I asked like to know more about them and like what they were, why they were, things like that. And again, they at this point they had stopped laughing, but they were kind of telling me that humanity had gotten it so wrong, and that it felt like they had made themselves known to humanity in an ancient past, and we had gone astray almost in terms of our understanding of them, or of their being or their truths. It was like there was some greater truth that we had gotten wrong, and they were not pleased with that, but also found it humorous in terms of like where we'd taken it today. But they told me that things had been happening, that actions had been undertaken to kind of redirect humanity and prep us for these beings or their truth to return to us. And they told me that this was something that was imminent, and when I say imminent and soon, I felt like it was like no more than a few years away, if that. And it did not feel like it was gonna be like an apocalyptic type return or the end of the world in like a violent sense or a cataclysm, but like that we would be entering a new phase of understanding and of knowing, and that would be completely opposite to everything that we have known thus far, and it would be a shock to everything and everyone. But nevertheless, it seemed like we had reached a point, we were close to a point where in their eyes we were quote unquote prepared, like enough almost to experience this. I guess that we could handle it to the degree that they were satisfied with. Alright, so I'm recording this second part of my experience a few months after the first part, so apologies if I repeat some things or if I have to think about some things a bit more, try to remember what happened. Most things are still pretty fresh in my mind, but just a heads up. So yeah, after the beings told me that something was imminent, I felt like I continued to make like a deeper connection with them on some level that was like more real than real, much beyond our physical sense of connection with those around us. I can't really explain it. It felt right. It felt positive, even though what they were saying wasn't necessarily always positive, probably more neutral on average, but just the connection with them and the interaction with them, it felt beyond anything I can describe or put words to. So let's see. I began to receive from them additional information about the way that I'm made contact with them, and how I got to that point. They were telling me that basically everything that I had been doing in terms of my research around the UAP phenomenon and my discoveries of the more woo side of things in recent years, links to consciousness, all of that, as well as meditation, was seemingly lining things up for me to get to where I was at that point. Almost like it was predestined in a way. Everything from specifics, like down to the gateway process meditations, to things specific within the gateway process, like aspects of the meditations themselves. For instance, there's an element known as resonant tuning in the first part of the gateway process that they teach you, and so far it's been in every meditation that I've done as I've progressed through that, and it's essentially like it's guided over the sound of what sounds like what I can best describe as like monks chanting or humming at a certain frequency. And it was like the beings were telling me that element is important. And as they were describing this, I began basically resonant tuning to the shamanic track that I was hearing in my earbuds. I just began humming to that track, almost the same way as I would during the gateway process meditations. It felt like they were telling me like to do this would not only keep me in that connection with them, but make it stronger. So I started doing that, and then they it was like I was receiving information about certain ways to position my hands while doing this. And since I had no real prior experience with meditation beyond the gateway process, I'd seen like, the stereotypical images of meditation or yoga where people are holding their index finger and their thumb together in like a loop with the rest of their fingers out while they're meditating. That's basically the extent of my knowledge or my awareness of any hand positions when it comes to meditation, but I knew it was a thing. So that I tried that, and it felt like just like the connection of my index finger with my thumb seemed to almost like gently amplify the positive connection I was feeling, in addition to what I was feeling by resonant tuning. And then I just like almost like innately started trying these other hand positions that I had never seen before. And one was essentially forming like a triangle with my index, with both my hands together, with my index fingers touching and my thumbs connected, and then kind of like the back fingers looping around. And then there was another one, which was slightly different, but also involved both hands connected and kind of opened a bit more. And it was only basically a few months later after this experience where I looked this up and I realized there was an actual term for these hand positions known as mudras that I had never been familiar with or never been exposed to in any way. And I found the two latter hand positions, the two latter mudras that I mentioned that I kind of innately knew to do, that seemed to amplify that connection the most. And coincidentally, it turned out, or maybe not coincidentally, it turned out they were both forms of what's known as lotus mudras, which are connected to and meant to open the heart chakra. And the first one I mentioned, the triangular one, is known as the flying or soaring lotus, and the second one is known as the mothering lotus. So yeah, I had no idea about any of that when this was happening, but they just kind of came to me, and they really felt like they were important to staying in that moment and amplifying it. Anyway, so I was doing that while I was resonant tuning, and it just felt like I was like in the zone. Like I can't even describe it. At that point, I was feeling this buzzing or like electrical pulse kind of going throughout my body, and I was feeling that slightly throughout the early stages of this experience. But once I did these mudras on top of the resonant tuning, that also amplified, and it felt like it was just like, I don't know, like when you get like a static electrical shock, imagine that feeling, but constant. So it wasn't painful, it was just like sensational, and it just kept going for a while. Again, sense of time is kind of warped, so I don't know exactly how long it was going for, but it was throughout most of my interaction with these entities, which was pretty cool. So anyway, back to the beings. Again, I felt like I received this information from them on how to do all this, and that basically everything I had been doing prior was to get me to this point, almost like developing abilities, but I had to follow a certain path to get there. Then I was kind of just trying to figure out what these beings were. I was trying to like figure out more about what I was experiencing and where I was. And these were kind of questions that I was putting out. And as I was doing that, I received the most vivid flash of imagery that I did throughout the whole experience. And it was an image of a person that looked like a human in a very snowy, icy, cold environment. He was wearing like almost like Eskimo type outfit, like a very thick fur coat with a hood. But it looked, his clothing and his environment made me, and just like the feeling I had made it feel like it was something very ancient, if not hundreds, then thousands of years ago. And I didn't provide this context before, but I have always, my whole life, for my whole adult life, I've been, well, most of my child life and throughout my adult life, I've been obsessed with snow, and I love cold weather. I'm a bit of a weather geek ever since I was a kid, but specifically when it comes to snow and ice, like something about it, just the way it makes me feel. Whenever we would go on family trips when I was younger, I would love going to the mountains, and that stuck with me as I became an adult, and to the point where I literally have gone to like cold weather destinations by myself around the world because my girlfriend hates the cold. She's from an island country, and she loves warm weather and tropical weather. But to the point where I would just go to these places on my own, even while I'm in this relationship, just because I want that. I feel like I long for that experience and just being in that environment, and just something about like the place it takes me emotionally and mentally. It's like I want to be there. Like my most recent trip, I specifically planned a trip to Iceland where I went by myself, and I just went out into nature and did some hikes and hiked up a volcano and up mountains just because I like the cold weather. I've gone on winters where we don't have much snow where I live in the US. I've driven to like the nearest microclimate that gets a lot of snow, which is about 3 hours west into the mountains, by myself, and spent the night just to time it right when they had like a minor snowstorm, just because we hadn't gotten any snow where I lived that winter. And my girlfriend thought I was crazy, but I just felt like I had to go and experience that. And, like examples like that just go on and on in my life. Anyway, so when I was experiencing this and I got this image of this person in this cold environment, almost like an ancient cold environment, I received like a feeling of as close to certainty as I can describe that was me in a past life. And I have no real awareness or knowledge or interest in like notions of past lives or reincarnation or things like that. Again, I was raised Catholic. I mean, I knew a bit about it, and I've heard a bit about it on some like shows. Like I watched that show that was based off of Leslie Kean's book about life after death. And like I've heard a few things here and there, but that's the extent of it. And my belief system never really took that into account. I never dismissed it entirely, but I never really thought about it much. And when I had this image, it was like almost certainty that like these beings were showing me this image of me in my past life. And it was like they were telling me, this is your answer to why you've been like this your whole life in this life. Like why you love the cold, why you do these crazy things that everyone thinks you're insane for doing by yourself and going into these environments by yourself, and the feelings and emotions you get from it. They are all because you were this person in your past life. And I felt super emotional once that realization hit me, and I felt like the emotions swell up suddenly to the point where I paused my earbuds and I took off the cover I had over my eyes and kind of like saw the actual like my physical reality around me. And I put my hand to my eye, my finger to my eye, and I felt a tear. And I looked at my finger and it was wet. Like it actually got me so emotional that I had tears in my eyes. So after I had the tears coming down my eyes, I put the blanket back over my eyes, turned the shamanic drumming track back on in my earbuds, and I was straight back in front of the beings again. This was like the second time I had removed and kind of stopped the process I was doing, gone back into physical reality, and then put the music back on and covered my eyes and gone right back in front of them as if nothing had changed, as if almost like it was just like this reality was like an interface and almost like a like a screen that I could go through and just be somewhere else and feel something else completely. So like the most immersive VR helmet you can think of, similar to like what was portrayed in the 3-body problem. So yeah, I was right back in front of them. One thing I did not mention is, in addition to this, I was feeling like the most sacred, the most holy, the most religious type of feelings of love and belonging around these beings and in this environment. It felt deeply familiar. It felt like something I had known, something that we had known, and we had all forgotten. And to the point where I was like incredulous, I was shocked, and I was like almost laughing at how we could have forgotten that, when this physical reality in that moment, it felt like a speck of reality in relation to that, almost like a speck in the cosmos. That's how tiny this reality felt. And when we're living it, we make it everything. Like our interactions, this message, me recording this is all like it right now. But in those moments, this felt like ridiculously small, like infinitesimally small. And I was just shocked at how we could have forgotten that. And that, like, the place that I was, the feelings that I was feeling, like that felt like where we belonged. And I didn't want to leave it. So I'm back in front of the beings, and they tell me that they tell me that we as humans had not been ready for them to make themselves known to us again for some time. Kind of like for how we'd gone astray and the entire constructs we had about reality and about them. But they said that they'd been doing things to prepare for a time when we're able to know them again. And again, when they said that, it felt like they meant something imminent. So I asked them, like, what do you mean? Or how you've been doing that? And in response, they showed me flashes, like full montage video scenes in like as real as physical reality is around us right now. I saw those playing out in front of me visually, of shows that I had seen before as examples of this. And I kind of got this understanding that they've been influencing the minds of filmmakers and creators through their work to kind of raise the zeitgeist of the public in order to prep us. And the shows, the first one I saw was a show from the Marvel superhero universe called Moon Knight, which takes place in present times in present day Egypt, London and then Egypt, and it's about this guy who works in a museum, and he seemingly has some sort of like a split personality disorder and dissociative split personality disorder. And he also realizes that he starts hearing this voice in his head talking to him and around in his physical reality. And he thinks he's just losing his mind. And he realizes later that, and he sees this being, that it's one of the ancient Egyptian deities named Khonshu, who's the god of time and the moon, and that it had basically tapped him to be his avatar in physical reality on Earth, to kind of both be his right-hand man on Earth, but to also at some points be able to kind of incarnate through him and affect and impact physical reality, almost like possessing him, and in doing so giving him some of his abilities. And throughout the show, he later realizes that there are other ancient Egyptian deities also doing the same thing. They have avatars, and that's kind of how the avatars are humans, and that's how they basically run things. But at the same time, that there was some agreement to not interfere with the affairs of man that had been made. And one of these avatars of one of the deities, Amit, had this, he was trying to resurrect her from being bound to this statue, so she can't do anything, in order for her to be able to more directly interfere and intervene on Earth, because she had these notions against the concept of free will, where she basically wanted to prejudge people for any future wrongdoings even before they had acted on them. And that was kind of her conception of cleansing the world from quote-unquote evil, even if that meant killing children, if there was a chance that they could grow up and do something wrong. So the main character and his deity basically were trying to stop this from happening, stop this level of direct interference on Earth from happening. And that's kind of the premise of the series. And the next show I got was this show called Ragnarok, which takes place in modern day Norway. And it's about this single mom with 2 teenage sons who moves to this like little village or little town in Norway. And at some point, the main character, her older son, I think he's neurodivergent in some way. They don't really specify in the show, but he has some sort of learning disability. And he either helps or saves this old woman crossing the street when they first get to the town. I don't quite recall how that happened, but he helps her in some way, and she turns out to be the incarnate form of one of the ancient Norse goddesses. I believe it was Freya, but I could be mistaken. But it was an important goddess, and she basically sees something in him when he does this, where she then does something that causes him to, throughout the show, essentially incarnate into and have the abilities of the god Thor from the Norse pantheon of the gods. And he later realizes, kind of similar to the first show, that she did this because some of the other gods and like figures in the Norse pantheon are interfering with the affairs of this town and modern and the present world in nefarious ways, and he has to stop them. So similar themes as the first show, but which was ancient Egyptian, and in this case it was the ancient Norse gods. And the last show I got was a show called The OA, which had various themes of Eastern spirituality sprinkled in. And it's the main character. She is this young girl living in Russia with like this loving father who's seemingly like, I don't know if he's an oligarch or what, but he has a lot of connections. But he treats her very well. She's going to school one day, I think, on a bus with her classmates, and there's an accident or an assassination attempt, I don't recall. Basically, the bus is driven or goes off of a bridge into like an icy cold river, and everyone dies, including the girl. Or we think she dies, but she ends up like appearing in this other realm or dimension where she's greeted by this kind of divine feminine figure, and she speaks to her in Arabic, I believe. And she's very loving, and there's this like sense of like familiarity, almost like she's like a motherly figure. And she's like welcoming her there, but she tells her, and she realizes like how much she loves her father back on Earth. And she tells her like, you can basically, that you have a choice. If you want to go back, return and stay with your father, you can. Or you can stay here with me. But if you go back, you have to give me something in return. And she ends up agreeing to that, and she has to give her eyes. So she returns fully blind. And she's basically blind for the next like decade or so of her life. She ends up back in the US at some point, and she's like looking for her father because she had lost him. And she's in the US, she's poor, she's blind, and she's like she turns out to be like a savant in the violin, and she's playing the violin like masterfully in the subway as a blind person. And she's approached by this guy who seems to like pick up on something about her. And you find out that he's this like mad scientist type character whose interest is studying near-death experiences, or NDEs, because of the abilities that some people seem to have come online after having an NDE experience. And that fits with some of the current research. So he like smooth talks her, and he approaches her because of how well she's playing the violin. And apparently like that was the give. And so, or the tell, sorry. So he approaches her, he smooth talks her, and he ends up essentially like kidnapping her and holding her in his lab at his home, where he has other kids with similar capacities that have come online for them who have had NDEs, and he's trying to study their brains by inducing NDE type experiences, basically bringing them to the brink of death in almost like a torturous way, to try to recreate what happened to them and see if he could quantify it and see what's happening in their brains. So there are, again, a lot of themes of like Eastern spirituality. There was this divine feminine figure in it, and there's these elements of like capacities that come online with NDEs sprinkled in. And there's also this element of precognitive things that are able to be sensed by these characters, these kids, and they develop these abilities that they have something to do with like moving or controlling energies in the physical world that somehow allow them to basically transverse through time and space in some way. So like all three of those shows again were flashed before me, almost like scenes from them, and they were essentially telling me like these are examples of shows of how those beings were preparing humanity for their return. So there was one point in this experience where I was like shifted by these beings, seemingly to my entire interaction with them thus far had been in this like void. It seemed like surrounded by blackness, besides the one that I could see, and then besides the visions they showed me, it seemed like I couldn't really distinguish anything else outside of that and what was going on visually. But at one point, it seemed like I was shifted to an environment that was more visual, where it was more natural too, and like connected to the earth. And it felt and kind of looked like I was in a forest surrounded by like greenery and plants and trees, and it was very magical and enchanted. That's the best way I can describe it. And there was like a fire that it was like a bonfire, and I just like instinctively felt like I wanted to dance. And I felt like I was dancing in this like cosmic, magical, enchanted dance that was fully liberating and free around this fire in this magical place with some of these beings who were not visible at this point, at least like visually, but I could feel their presence around me. And we were just dancing around this fire together, and it felt amazing. At this point, it felt like everything that I was doing and experiencing in my physical body, which was the shamanic drumming track I was listening to, the resonant tuning that I was humming, I was using to kind of hum and along with the track I was listening to, along with the two mudras that I was holding, along with the vibrational tingling sensations that were like electrifying my body. All of that seemed to be kind of manifesting in this magical dance that I was doing with these beings in this place, and it felt pure and familiar and just like fully natural. I don't really know how to put words to it, and it just felt liberating. So this went on for a bit, and then I was like transported back into that more of that void type space in front of these beings and in front of the one that I could see visually. So it seemed like they wanted me to have a chance to experience that, and it was great. But I was back in front of them, which also felt great. So I was back there, and at that point I was like in my mind I was like, oh shit, like I have almost forgotten about my primary interests, UFOs. So I asked them, what about the UFOs? And the beings responded, and I think the wording is important here. It was something to the effect of, the ones behind the UFOs are a faction of us who is breaking an agreement that we made to not show ourselves or reveal ourselves to humanity until you're ready. And the ones behind them are breaking that, and it seemed like they were not happy with it. Like the beings I was speaking with were not happy about that. I didn't get a sense that the beings behind the UFOs were viewed as evil or anything like that, but almost like they had a different strategy, and that they were somehow being manipulative in what they were doing, re humanity. So when they said that, all the connections came to mind with the first two shows that they had shown me, Ragnarok and Moon Knight, and the themes in those shows, which basically aligned with that concept. So yeah, around this point, I asked them, the beings, like, why are you telling me and showing me all this? I was feeling privileged and lucky to have this information, but I also got the sense that like I wanted to talk about it with people. And I asked them, like almost jokingly, like, do you expect me to be some kind of prophet with these messages I'm receiving? And their response, and this was kind of like how I translated it, was yes, but not from a point of ego, not from a position where this is a cool experience and it was just like I'm lucky to have had it and I want to just tell people because it's something cool that happened to me. So not from that standpoint, but from one where the information itself is relevant and critical to humanity and their consciousness and their understanding of reality. Yeah, so they said, yeah, like that's what we want you to do. So I kind of laughed at that concept, but I agreed. And then from that point on, the rest of the experience, that was the majority of the experience. The little bit that was left became a little bit hazy in my recollection, and in my confidence in the information that I was receiving. And that's because I got some information related to uh, Havana syndrome and the potential for some of the. I usually don't talk about this part of it when I'm relaying this story because I'm not sure of how accurate it is, but I'll just say that it had to do with Havana syndrome and the people who have experienced it at various consulates and embassies, and this notion that they were somehow, I'm not sure if it was all of them or some of them, were somehow connected to intelligence services and an effort to basically use similar contact modalities in the sense of like they were trying to do something to enhance their abilities to make contact or to have exposure to information or downloads from non-human entities, but to use that information for intelligence purposes, almost like they were intelligence gathering and gathering information about these entities. So from like a national security standpoint. And I'm not sure if there was like a nefarious intent on that end, but the information I received was that the Havana syndrome symptoms that we've heard about were some sort of either like side effect or direct response targeting these humans who were conducting these practices. Again, I'm not sure of that. That's just kind of what I came out with it from, and I also don't know how much of that was kind of constructed by my brain based off of, things I had heard up to that point, and it just kind of put different things together, whether it was like Gary Nolan's studies at Stanford, looking at the brains of experiencers and Havana syndrome patients and the similarities he found and things like that. So again, I'm not certain of that. But that was basically the gist of my experience. I came out of it again with this like strong desire to just want to tell people. And it started with those closest to me. I told the friend that I was with, I told him the whole story at first. Again, I had no idea if this was like a common occurrence with this type of psychedelic mushrooms, because I hadn't heard about these types of experiences with mushroom users. And yeah, he just said no, like he'd never heard of that. And then I went home. I went to my parents' house where there was like a family gathering, and I told most of my cousins and siblings who were all pretty like open-minded and progressive about this stuff, specifically substances. So I felt safe telling them, and they were blown away. They were like, "Yeah, we've never heard of anything like that happening." I wasn't sure how real, quote unquote, my experience was versus like how constructed it was by my physical brain. And at that point, I wasn't too well versed in these concepts of objectivity and subjectivity and the internal and the external, and how gray that area seems to actually be in reality, and how we're still novices in those concepts as humans. But again, I felt like I needed some sort of confirmation from those around me, and they had never heard of these types of experiences, so it started to seem like pretty anomalous to me. And then I had this like strong desire to tell my parents about it because they were super religious, still conservative, religious, traditional in their most of their views, and I received some my my sister was like, no, like, what are you doing? Don't tell mom and dad. It'll change their whole view of you. They'll think you're a drug addict. Like, it'll change their relationship with you. Um, so I was like, all right, I kind of dropped it for a bit. And then later that night, I was sitting having dinner, just me and my parents, and I'm just sitting there, like, uh, kind of jumping out of my skin, wanting to tell them. Eventually, I did. I tried to lead into it by talking about the therapeutic and mental benefits, the clinical trials, the historical kind of multicultural connection going back to indigenous communities with plant medicines and seeming connections with the quote unquote divine that these substances have been used for, trying to appeal to both their like scientific and religious minded curiosity, but they weren't having it. And they were like, why would someone need drugs if they're mentally stable? Like, why would someone need this to like help them if they're not depressed or something or have PTSD? Or why would someone need drugs to access God if they can just pray? So it didn't seem like they were getting the kind of profound nature of what I had experienced. So I got to a point where I was just like, you know what? You guys go to bed because I already did it. And their jaws just kind of like hit the floor. And they're like, what? Like, when? And I'm like, last night. And they were just shocked. They were dumbfounded. Yeah, they were shocked that I was sitting in front of them having a normal conversation. And them having spent the whole day with me and I was normal. And I had just done this the night before. So they wanted to hear the whole story. They're like, you got to tell us what happened. Like, what did you see? What did you feel? What did you experience? And I started telling them the story, and they were super interested. They were asking questions. They wanted to know more about the beings, and yeah, some interesting things came out of it. They drew parallels to like a religious, quote unquote, supernatural type experience that happened to a family friend of ours from Lebanon, who's a famous religious experiencer who had this like deeply mystical experience while praying and meditating in front of a monastery in the mountains in Lebanon in the early or mid 2000s. And he was essentially shifted to another dimension, kind of in his own words, where he thought he was unconscious and he came across this being of light. And it was all these emotions of like love and interconnectedness. And he asked this being telepathically, am I unconscious? And it responded to him, no, you're not unconscious. You're actually at the peak of consciousness and you're connected with everything around you in a sea of consciousness. And I would never have dug into that experience had my parents not brought it up when I talked about mine. And that just opened up whole new avenues and doors in my research and my kind of my approach to this now, which is a more like syncretic approach to how I talk about these experiences and like how I see the narratives and the language that we use around these and the possibilities to bridge the divides that have been constructed around the mystical in various ways, whether it's through religion, through politics, through cultures, through modernity and technology. If it weren't for that conversation with my parents about this, I don't think that would have happened. And a lot has happened since then that I kind of owe to that. That religious experiencer, by the way, his name is Raymond Nader, Nader. I ended up getting him to, again, he's a family friend of ours. So I got him to agree to do a podcast with Nathan, who's the co-host of Darren King, Exo-Academian, on his podcast, Liminal Frames. So Nathan agreed to do that with Darren's backing on one of Nathan's podcasts. So that was an interesting thing that I helped coordinate, where like I wanted to have this discussion with people who think they've had religious experiences, because there's so many connections there. And they don't just stop there. I mean, there's connections with near-death experiences, with out-of-body experiences, with various psi phenomena, with psychedelic experiences like mine, with spontaneous, Kundalini awakenings, and the list just goes on and on. So that, yeah, this was a transformative experience for me, and it opened up a whole new pathway for where I'm taking this in the future. And since then, I've repeated, let's see, today I'm recording this, it is October 2024. I've conducted the same contact protocol, I think about 9 times since then. And I've had various, I've had two other visual entity encounters where it was different types of entities that seemed more like plant and nature type entities that were humanoid in figure but made of like vines and plants. I've never seen them since, and I had never seen them before in any media or social media. I never heard about anything like that. They took me through like this like Odyssey type quest where they were pushing me to the brink on different concepts and notions, where I would feel almost like terrified at what they're telling me and showing me, but I would have to shift my awareness and like develop this higher understanding of what they're saying in order to fully grasp it. And at that point, I would kind of evolve and move on to pass and like move on to the next level. And after those experiences, I had experiences that seemed to be connected to my higher self, whatever that is. And I had no prior notions of that. I was not into the spiritual circles at all, so I didn't even know like what that concept really meant. But it felt like it was a version of me that had like access to these like deep cosmic mysteries beyond time and space, and I was communicating with it, and it was teaching me some of these like secrets, and they had to do with the nature of the universe. I was experiencing like fractal universes, I guess you would call it, where I was seeing these colorful fractals, and I was told that they were universes, and I was told that that's how I got here to this one, and that I had sent myself here, and I was being taught how to like navigate through these universes using things that have to do with like energy manipulation. And my physical hands during these experiences were being controlled. I was not in control of what was going on with my hands, and they were kind of moving around doing different things, and it felt like it had to do with energy movements. And yeah, these experiences have continued since then, and each time I've done this protocol, it's been one anomalous thing after the other, and in some cases manifesting in physical form in my body. So yeah, I'm interested to see where it goes, and that is essentially the gist of everything. Thank you so much for listening to my story and bearing with me. And again, I really hope this can be helpful to anyone out there exploring these beautiful, diverse, intricate topics. Whatever you're going through, I hope that this will be helpful. Please remember to hit those subscribe and like buttons on YouTube, and turn on alerts or notifications to keep up with our current releases.